Hi, good afternoon everybody, and welcome back. And today, we're going to go over our final video reviewing Unit 2 for AP World History. So here we go. We're going to discuss political systems and social systems as well of the various classical civilizations. So first, social hierarchy. In every classical civilization, and especially in the big empires, places like China, like the Roman Empire, etc., you see very distinct social hierarchies, social classifications. Now, in every society, there were going to be elite groups, and they weren't always exactly the same, but they always had some kind of privileges, some kind of special status, and they were kind of looked at as just different than, or sort of above the rest of society. Now, in India, in the caste system, Brahmins, the priests of the Vedic religion and early Hinduism, and then scholars became the sort of leading group in society, the leading caste in society, although they sometimes shared power with kshatriyas, the warrior caste, the ones who were political leaders. In Rome, patricians were the elites. They were the ones who owned land early in Rome's history and were from this group of hereditary families who were just considered elite because of this sort of long-held power and status. In China, under the Han Dynasty, that's where the scholar gentry, the elite government officials, who also were quite often big landowners as well, gentry, they become the elite group, and they're the ones allowed to wear special robes and have jobs in government and really kind of lead society. So all of these different groups had particularly different bases of power, but they were all elite in some way. And then you have big classes of commoners. And commoners could be wealthy merchants who did a lot of business and traded goods and banked and lent money and so on. Or it could be poor people, like peasants, like working class and laborers in cities. And within the commoner group, you had a big range of wealth and status and influence. But the attitudes that elites had about commoners, could be quite different as well. So in China, for example, merchants were looked at by the Confucian elite as parasites, people who didn't really sort of earn their money or didn't really make things that were productive. So they were officially lower status than peasants, the ones who did the work and farmed the land and built things. But in reality, of course, the people who made money were the ones who ended up having more influence versus those who simply had numbers on their side. Now, there were quite often peasant rebellions in every one of these societies among people who felt they were oppressed or unfairly treated. They had to pay rents that were too high, taxes that were too high. So there's never a sort of clear, people are sort of stuck in their space kind of system, and you do see some crossover and sort of differences in power. Now, in social mobility, this also varied quite a bit civilization by civilization. In India, in the caste system, officially you were born into a particular group and you stayed in that group. You might become wealthy, you might lose money, but you wouldn't really sort of change the quality of what you were as a human being, as a person. So there wasn't really social mobility available in the sense of like legal distinctions between groups. You couldn't move up from the merchant group into the priest group, but you could sort of within your group become very successful. Now, in China, under the Han Dynasty, you could get recruited or pass the exams and become a scholar gentry, a scholar official, by proving your value, proving your wisdom and worth through the exam system. In Rome, among the plebeians, money talked. If you were wealthier, you would have more political influence, more social influence. And you might even match the power of patricians. You might gain a job in the government. You might be someone who does sort of make his way up in society. Now, for labor organization, this also varied quite a bit civilization by civilization, the way that work was sort of organized and put to use. So in China, peasants were quite often forced, drafted into service or required to do a certain number of days of labor every month building public works projects or maintaining water systems or defensive walls or something. This forced labor among peasants was known as corvée, And this is something that is going to be pretty standard in big agricultural civilizations, where peasants will quite often be forced to do some kind of labor at some point, because there's just a lot of them and they don't have a lot of power. In India, you had lower castes who were expected to just be the ones who did manual labor. So in the Indian caste system, Shudras, people who were kind of the lowest caste, above outcasts, above the untouchables, they were the ones who did hard labor. That was their dharma, their obligation in life. In Rome, you actually have an enormous number of slaves doing all sorts of work. Agricultural labor on the latifundia, working in people's homes, mining, running businesses perhaps, but usually just doing some kind of hard physical labor or just kind of like tedious tasks. So, in some cases you have peasants and lower classes doing most of the forced labor. In Rome, you had a huge number of slaves. Greece, too, actually. Now, all of these civilizations were also somewhat patriarchal, although this could vary place to place. In China, women really didn't have a significant amount of legal power, and men, according to traditional Chinese law under the Qin Dynasty and Han Dynasty, men could actually have multiple wives, but women could not have multiple husbands. But there will be differences, though, in sort of the status that men and women have relative to each other. In Rome, women could quite often, if they were from elite families, become very well educated, very literate, just as knowledgeable in politics and so on as the men. And even though they didn't really have legal power or political power, they could still influence the men in their families. They could influence the boys being brought up under their tutelage. They could influence the men who they loved and loved them as husbands and wives. And this kind of sort of indirect influence by women is going to be pretty common among all civilizations. Women will sort of always be in the background politically and legally, but they're still human beings. And men who interact with women will still be affected by them in some way. So, moving along. Now, all of the empires we talked about, whether it was the Persian Empire under the Achaemenid dynasty, the Roman Empire, the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, the Gupta dynasty in India, they all used pretty similar techniques in empire building to actually expand and organize their empire. There are some things that just work and are just necessary if you want to govern a territory of millions of square miles and millions of people. There's some systems that are just sort of proven to work better for empires. Now, the word imperial, of course, just means having to do with an empire. So imperial administration is the way that empires are administered and governed. So all of these empires that were really long-lasting became somewhat centralized, where there would be a capital, and the emperor himself would be the one sitting there with government officials who would communicate with other territories, other provinces in the empire. So in the case of Persia, in Persepolis, the Persian king would be sitting there, and his satraps, his governors all over the empire, would be carrying out his commands, enforcing his laws, collecting taxes, recruiting soldiers, and so on. But the decisions, the big sort of decisions about law and peace and war and how the empire should be run is really happening at the center of power. But the organization of servants, of officials who work underneath the central authority to actually carry out the laws, that's known as bureaucracy. So, the Persian king, rather than just telling, the governor of Egypt, the satrap of Egypt, listen, I don't really care what laws you enforce, just make sure that, it stays peaceful. But otherwise you can have really all of the power there. That's not bureaucracy. That's not centralization. But when the king sends out his guys, when he sends out his people, his officials, to be his eyes and ears, to be his kind of arms there to actually do the work, that is bureaucracy. When there's this whole sort of several layers of organization of officials carrying out government business. So, every one of these governments has some kind of legal system where laws are, available, and laws are, for the most part, standard across the empire. Rome is where you really had the most sort of heavily standardized legal system across the entire empire. And by becoming a citizen of the empire, you could gain access to, protection by that legal system. But in all of these empires, though, there will be some kind of legal system in place that, helps maintain this idea that, we're not just ruling by force and power, we're ruling because we bring law and justice to people who might otherwise not have had law and justice on their side. So, Persian kings, Chinese emperors, they're always claiming that they are bringing law and order and the ability for people to have justice and be protected by the law rather than just anarchy and lawlessness. Now, in all of these places, China really the least so out of all of them, though. The central government will quite often make deals with the people they've conquered in order to, draw officials from those people and soldiers to make it clear that, we want you to participate in the empire. We don't just want to rule over you with an iron fist. So Rome and Persia, and, yes, they did quite often bash a lot of heads and cause a lot of destruction while in the process of conquering places. But they usually made it clear that if you join the empire, then local elites, among the Gauls or among people in Spain or in Egypt, will be allowed to have still a lot of influence. And, we might recruit them to be government officials. We'd like to recruit soldiers because we know that you have effective warriors among your people. So there is this effort to absorb all of the different people of an empire and make it part of a single whole. And also, because that allows the central government to kind of adapt to the people that they're conquering, rather than trying to force them to adapt to, being Persian or being Roman. And all of these empires will rely on very well-armed and well-trained professional armies. And as, an empire like Rome expanded and became more experienced and brought in more technologies from the people they conquered and more ways of fighting from the people they conquered, quite often they kind of took on a momentum of their own, where their armies became so effective and so well organized and well equipped that there was really no way for these smaller civilizations to really defend themselves effectively. So, continuing along. Oops, I forgot to delete something here. Well, the second part here, promoting trade and projecting power. This is another big aspect of what empires actually do. So, empires, in order to collect tax revenue, there has to be wealth moving. There have to be goods moving and being traded. Things have to be produced. Money has to be in circulation so governments can tax that. So, governments will promote trade in order to actually sort of get things moving around their empire. And in addition to that, besides just the self-serving idea of, taxing trade, any good government will always promote the idea that it's working to make their people more prosperous, more secure financially and economically, that their people will have more access to resources and to all of the good things that civilization has to offer. So, by expanding and promoting trade and production, this allowed empires to make this claim, I'm looking out for the best interests of my people. And if you join the empire and are loyal, you can be part of this network of growth and production and exchange. So, roads allow easier trade, and every empire will build enormous road networks. The Romans were most famous for this. And canal systems to make it easier to move goods around by ship. So China was very famous for their canal system. Water management systems to bring fresh water, to make fresh water more available for farming and for use in cities, for fountains, for baths, for sewage, etc. So water management is a major part of the civilization that empires promise to bring to people. Defensive walls to protect the whole country, to protect individual cities. The Great Wall of China, which the Qin dynasty began, is a good example of this. But every major city in the classical world will probably have some kind of defensive wall system around it. That's expensive. Only a big imperial government can really build and maintain something like that. Supply lines for the army, usually including these road networks to make it easier for armies to stay well fed and well supplied even while they're out fighting wars. Monumental building, so it's not just building the stuff that's useful, it's building temples, like the Parthenon in Athens, Greece, like building literal monuments, like Ashoka building his rock pillars to display his power and promote his laws and justice and so on. And statues of Roman emperors, and Qin Shi Huangdi, his tomb with 6,000 stone soldiers, protecting him in the afterlife. This was another way of just showing the power and greatness of an empire, of a civilization. And the use of money, this promoted trade. It made it easier to do business when people have coins in circulation. But this is also another propaganda tool, another way of projecting power. Because like a Roman coin here, for example, with a picture of Augustus on it, the first Roman emperor, this is propaganda. No matter what corner of the empire you're in, you see Augustus's face on the money that is in your hand and in your pocket. And there's usually a message there. Like this one said, Divi Filius, Pater Patriae. That means son of a god, father of the country, Caesar Augustus. There he is, what a guy. But this was a dual purpose, promote trade and propaganda, project power. So, now, social and political structures, though, could quite often be affected by religion and belief systems. So obviously the Hindu caste system is a major example of this, where each of the 4 castes, or the 4 varna in the system, represented a different spiritual quality. Brahmins being the highest quality, Kshatriyas second highest, Vaishyas third, Shudras fourth. And then, of course, the untouchables, the people who were so impure, according to Hindu belief, that they were outside of the caste system altogether. Now, within this system, yes, there could be inequality and discrimination between classes, but it was more just a sort of idea that you were born as something, and that quality, based on your previous lives, you had to accept and embrace and do the best you could within that context. So if you were born as a merchant, it was perfectly fine to make lots of money and be the best merchant you could, because that was part of your dharma, as long as you're also a good person and you treat others properly as well. So doing your dharma could quite often mean being really successful at whatever you were born as. Now, jati then were the sort of smaller subdivisions within each varna. So within the Vaishyas, there were different kinds of merchants, different kinds of artisans, different kinds of shopkeepers. They would all be the particular groups that people would really consider themselves part of, and that would be their main social group. So within a jati, the expectation was you would, have an arranged marriage to someone else from your jati to make sure that there wasn't mixing between people of different spiritual qualities, thus, upsetting the system and impurifying each other's spiritual quality. Now, also within India, though, you have Ashoka the Great, who's one particular king from the Mauryan dynasty in the 200s BCE. He's really the only king of serious note in Indian history who adopted Buddhism as his official religion. Now, he didn't discriminate against other religions. He just promoted Buddhist principles as the basis for his rule. And the story about him is that he was so sort of horrified after reflecting on the brutality of the conquests he made early in his career that he decided to devote himself to the compassion and the sort of justice and spiritual development that Buddhism demanded. So then he based the remainder of his career on these principles. And at least in the laws that he left behind, inscribed in stone, he promoted this idea that he was a tolerant and compassionate and sort of wise and, nonviolent king, which I guess is kind of like what the Persians did. They tried to promote this idea that they they weren't here to conquer and dominate you. They were taking over your country to liberate you, to bring you justice and peace and protection, so you could support the forces of good in the struggle against evil in the world. This very Zoroastrian idea. So, but the Persians, of course, were always very tolerant of other religions. And they had the attitude that, listen, as long as you are on our side, you are supporting good. And your gods, as well as our God, have decided to make us your king, to liberate you from whoever ruled you before. So this idea of the Persians as kind of like the liberating saviors of all of the people they conquered was a very sort of powerful propaganda idea. Now in China, of course, there's a few examples of how religion and belief affected political systems. In the Qin dynasty of the 200s BCE, Shi Huangdi, the first Qin emperor, adopted legalist attitudes about government. He didn't care if you were rich or poor, high or low. The law was the law, and it applied to you the same as it applied to everybody. And government officials were expected to follow the law the same way that peasants and merchants and landowners were. And he also wanted to reward people who were loyal and followed the law. So he was worried about big landowners getting too powerful and being able to ignore the law and ignore paying taxes, for example, and mistreat peasants. So Qin Shi Huangdi quite often broke up big estates owned by big landowners to distribute land to peasants in order to just break the power of those big landowners that they might be able to have against the government, to show that the law is supreme and the dynasty is supreme, and it does not matter what class you're from, you are subject to the law. But the Qin dynasty and then the Han dynasty after them and every other Chinese dynasty afterward will always claim the mandate of heaven. This idea that heaven, the gods, have given that new dynasty, whether it was the Han or somebody else, the right and really the job, the expectation that they're going to rule in order to promote harmony and to rule on behalf and for the good of all of the people of China. And if they didn't do this, if they became corrupt, if they became incompetent, then they might lose the mandate, and it would be passed to the next dynasty that would rise up and overthrow them. So the Han dynasty, they overthrew the Qin dynasty after a wave of peasant rebellions against the brutality of Qin rule. Now the Han dynasty then, they adopted Confucianism, and their official hierarchy and philosophy of government was based on Confucian principles. Confucian principles of wisdom and virtue as the basis for leadership, and that leaders should lead by example rather than by force, like legalists would have argued. So, in the Han Dynasty, even though they still used rewards and punishments the same way the Qin did, the Han Dynasty also elevated people to the rank of government official through recruiting and through the exam system that made people prove that they were wise, that they understood Confucian principles of virtue and responsibility in order to actually have that status. And the exam system, based on Confucian principles, became a central part of Chinese government for centuries afterward. Now, in addition, they also, kind of like the Qin, were worried about big landowners getting too powerful. So they would also reform and redistribute land once in a while in order to break the power of big landowners. And once again, they also theoretically elevated peasants above merchants, although in reality, merchants were still quite often ones who could become wealthy and influential. So, moving along. Now, empires, of course, decline, collapse, transform at some point as well. And all of these classical empires are no exception to this rule. At some point, they've expanded so much that it's just too difficult to maintain order, maintain security everywhere. And once there's like a crack somewhere along the frontiers, a lot of other cracks start to show up. And it becomes kind of a cascade of trying to put out these fires. So if the Xiongnu, these nomadic peoples to the north of China, if they invade in one spot and the Han have to send an army up there to fight them, then it becomes more difficult to maintain defense in other spots, and in other spots, and in other spots. So this becomes kind of a cycle once it begins. And in addition to that, all of these empires had to deal with political crises internally. So in the Roman Empire, in the 200s CE, like 50 different guys claimed to be emperor, had armies loyal to them, within the Roman military system, and just decided to fight each other. And once you have civil wars and these crises over who is in charge and who is a legitimate authority in the government, then people start to lose faith in the government altogether. And if the people of a country or an empire perceive their government as being illegitimate, not really being fit or really being the right people to rule the country, this can severely undermine the ability of that government to maintain authority, unless they use increasingly brutal forms of force or decide to just give up altogether. Now, in the midst of these civil wars and invasions by outsiders, then you start to see economic crises, because when there are invasions, that makes it more difficult to trade if there's a lack of security, and in order to pay for an ever-expanding army, especially if the army's fighting itself in a civil war, the people who control different parts of the empire might raise taxes too much to the point where it becomes oppressive, or they might, make the currency less valuable so they have more of it to actually give out and pay for soldiers, and that can lead to economic problems. In addition, sometimes the elites in a society can actually have too much power, and especially when it comes to big landowners in a place like China or in the western part of the Roman Empire, if the people who own huge amounts of land and take in rent from their peasants and just have a lot of independent wealth, if they become so wealthy and powerful that they can just stop paying taxes, that they can hire their own soldiers and just dare the central government to do something about it, this can lead to a breakdown in central government authority as well. In addition, epidemic disease sometimes occurs in conjunction with these other issues. This actually happened in the Roman Empire in the 500s. And then, of course, invasions by outside forces as one final piece to this puzzle. Now, in Western Europe, Germanic peoples prior to the 2 and 300s CE, they were quite often actually invited to sort of migrate in a controlled way, or to join the army of the Roman Empire and be sort of absorbed into the system. But eventually, though, you start to see an inability by the central Roman government to stop Germanic invaders from just establishing their own independent kingdoms and refusing to give any loyalty to the central Roman government. So, you start to see the situation where Western Europe gets kind of carved up by Germanic invaders, and parts of northern China get kind of carved up by Xiongnu invaders in the same way. So, now in these cases then, by the 300-400s, in both of these cases, the government of these empires is really not there anymore, in the sense that they control the extent of territory to which they had earlier in the classical era. But in the Han Dynasty, the dynasty just collapses completely, and there is no more Han Dynasty by the 200s CE. In Rome, though, there's more of a transformation that occurs. And the transformation that occurs is that the Emperor Constantine, in the early 300s CE, he's the same emperor who also legalized Christianity for the first time and organized the Catholic Church, to govern Christianity for the first time. He decided that Western Europe, because it was less populated and less wealthy than the eastern part of the Roman Empire, he decided to just move the capital from the Roman Empire, from Rome in Italy to Constantinople, which originally was called Byzantium, but he renamed it Constantinople after himself. This city was in a much more easily defensible place. It was in an area with more population, more wealth, more trade, more food being produced, and he felt that it would be easier to defend Constantinople and this eastern part of the empire instead of the west. So within a couple hundred years then, even though there were some attempts for the empire to hold on to Western Europe, it got carved up and political power transferred to these Germanic tribes, Germanic chiefs, who set up their own little kingdoms. So people like the Franks and the Alemanni and the Burgundians and the Visigoths. These new groups of people established power, and eventually the city of Rome was actually taken over by Germanic invaders as well. So by 500 CE, Western Europe is no longer part of the Roman Empire, and the eastern part of the empire, around Constantinople, they kept on going, and the emperor in Constantinople kept calling himself the Roman emperor, kept calling himself Caesar. And even though they no longer actually controlled Rome, the empire was still called the Roman Empire, because they were doing things the Roman way, and they sort of had this dream of one day taking back Rome and expanding again. Now, historians later on, looking back on this, will call this new sort of eastern version of the Roman Empire, that's a little bit smaller and compact, the Byzantine Empire, rather than the Roman Empire, simply because that's an easy way to remember how this thing is now different, even though it's still continuing the Roman Empire. So you can kind of look at it as both, the Roman Empire, but also something new as well. Now, in every major civilization there were cities. And cities were centers of culture. So Athens, for example, in Greece, was a center of art and philosophy and culture and literature, as well as being a center of trade and wealth production. So you can see centers as cities of culture. They can also be centers of trade and centers of political systems and religious institutions as well. So Rome was a center of trade. It was the biggest city in the Roman Empire for most of its history. So it required the most goods, the most food to be imported, and the most goods were produced there and exported. And it was a center of religious power because there were all sorts of religious festivals in the Roman polytheistic system. And eventually this became probably the most powerful city in Christianity because the Christian community and bishop in Rome were considered the most influential, in the early Catholic Church. Alexandria, the system set up by Alexander the Great, the city established by Alexander the Great in Egypt during his conquests, this became another city kind of like Athens that was a center of culture and science and philosophy. Now, in China, Chang'an is one of the historic capital cities of China. The Han Dynasty was based in Chang'an, and later dynasties as well, as we're going to see, adopted its capital as well, as a way of kind of connecting itself back to the greatness of the Han Dynasty. Constantinople, the second capital of the Roman Empire, and then the capital of the Byzantine Empire, that becomes a major power center just like Rome, and that's where the Hagia Sophia, this major Christian cathedral, is constructed in the 500s. And in the Persian Empire, Persepolis was their great political capital as well. So, that is all for today. That is the final video for Unit 2. And good luck on the exam, and I will see you next week.